Good morning. Good morning. Man, we began to quieten down, so I guess the expectation is it's time to start, right? I was going to wait another minute or two to see who walked in, but it is about, it didn't feel right. It's about 34, 35 after, so great to see everyone here this morning. Temperatures are beginning to cool a little bit, right? Feel a little bit better than those mid to high 90s, 100-degree temperatures. Missed you last week. We were in Abilene. Went to go see Maddie out in Abilene, and so that was good and a great weekend for us. But I understand Pat did class here, and y'all spent some more time on the fourth commandment, the Sabbath. Remember the Sabbath, keep it holy, and just kind of how that, the history of that from maybe the time that commandment was given to today. And so just kind of review and recap a little bit. We've been studying the Ten Commandments now for several weeks, and a document, if you will, that was given to us a long time ago. If you look at history, several thousand years ago, and but I think as we have walked through the Ten Commandments and looked at what God had to say at that moment in history, it is a document that is still very much relevant, still very much applicable, and really timeless, maybe you would say. You think about the Ten Commandments and when they were given, and you go, man, that was so long ago. Is there anything that's that old, close to 4,000 years old, that's still relevant and applicable today? And I hope that each time that we look at, study, that maybe you go, wow, I didn't really think about that, I didn't realize, but still very applicable today. Just reminding you as we have walked through these commandments, the first several commandments, you'll remember we talked about how they really help us in terms of how we perceive God and how we look at God Almighty in terms of Him being the Creator, the one and only real God, and our reverence towards Him. And so I think everything that was done for a reason, right? I think everything has to start with that. We talked a little bit about how all sin, in my opinion, really generates out of two different, I think two, maybe you could argue three, but two different faults. I guess you'd say number one is not keeping God in the proper perspective. All right, and so the first few commandments remind us of keeping God in the proper perspective. And then number two, to me, sin generates out of just selfishness. Some people might say that all sin is generated out of selfishness, but I would say maybe not keeping God in the proper perspective, and then just human selfishness. So we started with a few commandments that reminded us of how to keep God in the proper perspective. the reverence that he is deserved. And then we went to a couple of commandments that were really maybe obligations, okay? The commandment that Pat kind of went back over last week, to remember the Sabbath, to keep it holy. Maybe that has changed somewhat from what the Israelite people knew back when that commandment was given, but I still feel like there's, as we talked about a few weeks ago, there's still a little bit of an obligation, maybe not a little bit, maybe just a legitimate obligation for us to slow down within our 7-day week, to take time to worship and to acknowledge God Almighty, our Creator. Okay? And then I think most recently an obligation to, anybody remember, this was 2 weeks ago when we were together. What was the commandment we looked at 2 weeks ago? The 5th commandment? Yeah, to honor your father and mother. And we spoke for a while and looked at that in detail, what that means and the impact that it has on your family, on your community. Really, we even went as far as to say on our nation and all nations of the world, for children to honor their fathers and mothers. So an obligation there as well. But now we kind of transition from those first handfuls of commandments into the 6th commandment. I think I put a slide in here to just remind us of the commandments being timeless. But the 6th commandment of thou shalt not murder, okay, that seems to be pretty straightforward, pretty simple, pretty, if I would have given you all a sheet of paper and given you a test when we started this study and said, which commandment do you struggle with the least? This might be the one that you would have written down, right? I don't know that I've murdered anyone recently or in my entire life. This seems to be pretty straightforward, pretty simple for everyone. But I don't know, as we dig a little bit deeper and look at this commandment and think about it a little bit deeper, maybe we learn something from this as well, okay? Seems like a commandment that we could spend 3 minutes on and move on, all right? But, I'll start with just reminding you, you look at the bottom line of that, thou shalt not murder. When I was a kid growing up, okay, and some of you or maybe have just a few years on me, can remember this as well, but, I look around right here. It's hard to find any Bibles, but, back in the day, these were all King James versions, right? When I grew up at Austin Avenue Street Church of Christ in Brownwood, Texas in the 70s, that's all you could find in the pew there. And so, the King James version really said, thou shalt not kill, was the commandment that we would read and understand, and you kind of go, all right, well, let's dig a little bit deeper into that. And so I want us to look a little more closely at just those two words, murder and kill. And as I've studied this and looked at it, gone back and studied that a couple of different words in the Hebrew language as well, much like our English language today. The Hebrew word for murder was ratshach. I'm sure I butchered that and how I said that, but the Hebrew word for kill, Hebrew word for murder, ratshach, Hebrew word for kill, harag. Okay? So two different words there as well in the Hebrew language, much like our murder and our kill. And so it was kind of, you start thinking a little bit deeper and you look at it a little bit deeper. What does it mean to murder someone? What does it mean to kill someone? Hopefully it kind of spurs a little bit of thought in our minds that there's a difference there, and helps us to study and look at this commandment a little bit deeper than maybe what we would have to begin with. You know, when you look at the word murder, okay, from what I have studied, to murder, the definition there is the unlawful and or the immoral taking of another human life. Okay, the unlawful and or immoral taking of another human life. All right, whereas killing is simply, I shouldn't say simply, I don't know that there's anything simple about killing, but killing is to bring a life to an end, okay, to end a life, not necessarily unlawfully or immorally, but just to end a life, bring life to an end. And so you all right? Well, what does that mean to us in this commandment, and why should we even be too concerned with something like this? Well, there are differences, and I think they're important to acknowledge, because there are certain circumstances that we could look at and we could go, all right, does God contradict himself in the Bible in terms of saying thou shalt not kill? Well, maybe the word really that we need to embrace there is thou shalt not murder, okay? That's why if something were to happen to someone in the workplace, an accident in the workplace, and they were to have an accident and die, we would say that person was accidentally killed at work, okay? We would not say that person was accidentally murdered. All right, that's how we relate that in the human language, in the English language that we embrace today. We could apply that even to situations like this, to where I've got a fly flying around me. I wouldn't say that I murdered a fly with a fly swatter, okay? I killed a fly, all right? And this is really just even how we look at some of these detailed situations, particular situations that we encounter almost daily, all right? And it kind of brings to light that there is clearly a difference in killing and murdering, all right? As I kind of looked at this, there's probably not too many situations in our English language and the way we talk today that would differ from that, okay? Serial killers, that's probably one of the only places that I can find in modern day English that our language, the way we describe that, does not really match up. But mostly, we do clearly differentiate between killing and murdering, all right, especially in situations like this that I'm showing you here. And so, that brings you to the point of asking the question of, is it ever okay to kill? And that's tough. That's probably, just growing up as a kid, and you learn a little bit about the 10 Commandments, and you hear thou shalt not kill, and then you start scratching your head going, oh man, there's a lot of killing that went on in the Old Testament that if you want to read the stories, some of those Bible stories you didn't really learn as a kid. You started kind of encountering them as a teenager, and you would start going, wow, I never learned about this before. We learned all the nice and easy and pleasant things as I grew up in Bible classes. But you do begin to realize that there's some killing that takes place, throughout history. And is that okay? Is that all right? It's a tough question, isn't it?
Whenever God gave the land to the Israelites, they killed everything, every living thing.
Mm-hmm.
So,
right. A lot of God. A lot of God's instructions. A lot of God's instructions to the Israelite people in the Old Testament about what they had in front of them, what He had in store for them, included some killing. You know, we live in a world today where there's just, I don't know, I think if you go and look at the murder rate in the United States in recent years, I mean, especially in some inner city places, Chicago and other places throughout the United States, it's just skyrocketed. It's unbelievable. And you consider things like that happened in Uvalde here in Texas months ago that are just unbelievable. And they make us sick, just terrible situations. But, you know, is it ever okay to kill? That's a tough question. It's things we don't really like to talk about. You know, this is something that comes to mind when you talk about that. You know, how many of you in here, you don't have to raise your hand, but how many of you in here, you know, have a weapon, have a gun, have a firearm close to your bed? Here in the state of Texas, there's probably a lot of us that do. And I would imagine it would probably be that way around the country. I do, all right? And if this situation were to pan out, and we could build tons of scenarios here, all right? And I don't want to get into chasing a bunch of rabbits, but in this kind of scenario, if this were to happen, an intruder and someone had to reach into their nightstand and pull out a weapon to protect themselves in the middle of the night, and something like this were to happen, and I hope that it does not to any of us ever, but if it did, here in small town Burnet, it'd probably make the newspaper within the next week, right? I would think.
Well, it'd make national news.
It might make national news, okay? But those headlines probably would not be that, you know, Kurt Jones murdered an intruder, okay? It might be that Kurt Jones killed an intruder that came into his home and meant his family harm. And so there is a difference there in terms of when we say an unlawful, an immoral taking of another person's life. And so I want us to understand that as we look at these kind of situations and understand what God's commandment, sixth commandment, meant to us when he said that, thou shalt not murder. Thoughts?
I know that in World War I and also partially in World War II, it was a big problem for military men.
You bet.
Because they were not able to differentiate between murder and killing.
Mm-hmm.
And there were several people who refused to go in the military because of it.
Yes, ma'am.
Your King James
Mm-hmm.
was responsible for a lot of things. And as later on they changed the wording in the newer translations and overcame that. But it was a real problem back in World War I and World War II.
Yes, ma'am. She's talking about times of war. And so it jumped out ahead of me a couple of slides, but I'll jump on. We'll come back to capital punishment maybe. But, what about in times of war? And so this is, the questions that we ask, and this is actually, both my grandfathers here in pictures in World War II, okay? My grandfather over there on the right side picture is right in the bottom middle, has his fist clenched up a little bit. But he was part of 313th Combat Engineers in World War II that came up through southern Italy and helped to liberate Rome. And so as a combat engineer, he really did not, he wasn't on the front lines or anything of that nature. And so I absolutely loved, before both of my grandfathers passed away, I loved sitting around and visiting with them, asking them questions about World War II, digging for history and little tidbits. I was a U.S. history teacher for about 12 years at the high school and loved World War II history, okay? My grandfather on the left over there is in the back left corner, and he was infantry, okay? And he was in hand-to-hand combat and battle up in northeastern France around the Battle of the Bulge and all that type of stuff, for those of you that remember all of that. And my grandfather on the right, he would talk a whole lot more and tell me more stories than my grandfather on the left. He didn't like to talk too much about it. And of course, as I've grown older and I've thought about it, it's probably because he had to kill. He probably had to kill. And I think he killed many people, I would imagine. He never said that directly to me, okay? But it's made me think through the years, about this situation and just all that surrounded World War II. And I really do believe, we could sit here, we could have a whole nother series in class on war and times of war, but, there are rules of war. And at that particular time with Germany and Japan and what they were trying to do to the rest of the world, we had soldiers, we had armies that had an obligation to protect our nation and to take care of the people here that lived in this nation, and really to protect the rest of the world. And so to me, those are not unlawful killings. Those are not immoral, unlawful killings. And, we could dig down into the details of all of that. I know by studying world history and wars and World War II even, and Vietnam, and you can go down the list. I know that there have been unlawful killings inside of wars. And that's unfortunate, okay? But there are most definitely times throughout history where it is necessary to kill. All right? And it's unfortunate, but it's necessary.
Ordinarily, with the military, it was a case of kill or be killed.
That's right.
It was all there. I remember World War II very well.
Yes, ma'am.
And,
Those times are tough. Very tough. We'll back up a slide here. Capital punishment. I really do not intend to get political in here and for this to move down a political avenue, but that's a tough one as well for us to scratch our head about, okay? But I really think if you go back and you study God's nature and His words to His people, okay, there is a call for those that murder, for those that take lives immorally and unlawfully, okay? There is a call for punishment for those people. And I think if you look at it closely, then you understand maybe more clearly capital punishment. And it's not an easy thing to talk about. It's not an easy thing to look at in the eye and discuss, but God's Word and His nature, it's pretty clear as to capital punishment. Now, I know in the world and country that we live in, and we continue to move further and further away, Texas, the state that we live in, is probably embraces capital punishment as much as any state in the Union. Okay? But that is definitely a head scratcher. It provokes a lot of thought when you start looking into things like capital punishment. Boy, not too many people want to talk this morning, do they? It's just kind of, this is difficult, and my slides are moving fast, and I'm trying to provoke a little thought and question. Because if not, we're going to finish pretty early this morning. But go ahead, Clay. I knew you were thinking of something over there, and you're holding back. But.
In Exodus chapter 19, there was capital punishment for touching Mount Sinai.
Yeah, Clay's going back to Exodus chapter 19, you said, and there's capital punishment described. Say again the last part of what you said.
For touching the mountain, they're to be stoned.
Oh, for touching the mountain, yeah.
Killed with arrows.
Yeah. Simply for not doing what God has commanded at that point in time.
The same thing with the unruly child. The same thing with the unruly child. The rebellious child, what did they do?
Now, Will's getting into some stuff that, boy, we'd need like 2 series to dig deep into an unruly child.
Is we have examples of where in the Bible we are told directly to eliminate those people.
Will is referring to Will is referring to an unruly child in the way it is described in the Old Testament and dealing with that child. And that is tough. There's a lot of people who go, oh man, I don't know about this God you serve and worship and the consequences of just an unruly child should be put to death. If you look even more closely at that instruction, I really think it's beautifully worded, because God does not instruct the parents, to put that child to death. That would be dangerous, wouldn't it? We've all kind of felt like there were moments when, yeah, that's right.
None of us.
Yeah. If you look at that more closely, God speaks of taking that situation before elders, a committee of elders, to look at that situation, to then make a decision based on what they see. People that are really not really a third party.
You have to say it, but it's a governmental body.
It is. It is.
So the same way with capital punishment, it goes through a system before it ever gets to.
You bet. And if you look at those situations, and especially I think if you study Israelite history, it's really, really, really hard to find. I don't know that you can find a particular instance of a panel of elders putting a child to death. I would challenge you to go find that. I'm not saying it never happened, but what I am saying is that I think that statement in itself by God made families and children realize that it was serious enough that if you are, that adamant about rebelling against your parents and your family, that is this kind of serious offense. And so we're running down a different path here right now a little bit, but trying to keep us on. I mean, that is capital punishment. Okay. Okay, go ahead.
I ran into this in rehab, and we had
All right.
a woman brought to the facility who had murdered someone. And they wanted her to keep that a secret. Well, she shared it in an AA meeting that she had killed this man with her hands.
Right.
And I was in her room with her.
Okay.
And so after that, I was extremely uncomfortable because the woman
Sure.
had some really weird behavior.
You bet.
And but as a Christian, should we be welcoming them back into society once they've served their time? This woman had served 25 years in prison for what she had done. I felt like as a Christian, I didn't really give her a fair shake as another human coming back into the reality of life after 25 years in prison. You're just automatically shaken by the knowledge that this person is capable of that. But as a Christian, how should you handle that? Should you
Yeah.
pray for that person and see how it turns out, or should you distance yourself?
Yeah, that's tough. It's really, really tough. But we start to move down this path of judgment. Okay, and I don't want us to I understand totally what you're saying, and I'm glad you asked the question. I don't want us to get rolling down this path of judgment too much, because do these commandments still apply to us today? Are they still relevant today? Are they still the basis for the most blessed life that God could give us today? I believe they are. Okay? But are we saved by following these 10 commandments today?
No.
We're not. We're saved by the blood of Christ. Okay? And so there are offenders of, and we're all offenders, you know. Is that sin more, you know, is that an unforgivable sin to God as opposed to thou shalt not steal? Have you ever stolen anything? I remember I stole something when I was about 5 years old in Mott's convenience store, a little piece of gum down on the bottom row, you know. And when my mom found out in the parking lot, I had to go back in and apologize, and I stole. Okay? Can that be forgiven? Absolutely it can. And so, yes, it is really, really tough. If I were sitting here this morning and sitting right next to me was a known murderer, it might make me wiggle in my seat a little bit, and I don't know if I could, you know. But that's probably my problem, not God's problem. God knows that person's heart, and if that murderer, if their heart has changed and their heart is right, man, that's tough for me to figure out how God can do that, but He can.
I think if they were sitting by you in church, it might be a little safer.
A little safer if they're sitting by you in church, yeah. A serial murderer sitting by you in church, I still might move all the pencils and everything out of the way, you know, I don't know.
We're looking to Jesus, we have to accept
Well, there's always love the sinner, hate the sin.
Yeah.
And everybody here can murder. There's not a single person here that if the situation was right, would follow through. And you have to remember that. That person just followed through, where as Christians, we should never follow through on that, but we have the same ability. We're all capable of the exact same things as every other killer out there, or murderer, I should say.
Sure.
So we should always look into it at first as if they're trying to change, not to understand that they did that, and obviously be wary of them, because they've done it, and you obviously don't want to be a second reenactment. So you're going to
Sure.
watch them a little bit more, but at the same time, as a Christian, you
And
should
keep
be
an eye
looking
on
at trying to look past that
Yeah.
and save the soul.
Louise keeps.
So are you going to bring up Matthew 5:21?
Well, I'll let you if you want. That sounded like sounds like you want to bring it up, Louise. I'll let you. Go ahead.
No, you can read it.
Matthew, what is it?
21.
5:21. You want to read it?
Okay. You have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court, and whoever shall say to his brother, Raka, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. And whoever shall say, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. I guess that's probably enough.
You bet.
I think murder is of the heart.
It is, yeah.
And we can murder of the heart.
Mm-hmm.
And that is under God's law.
You bet.
It is under New Testament law.
100% agree with what Louise read to us. If you really look backwards at much of this described in the Old Testament, murder is described by starting with hate within the heart, okay? It oftentimes in Deuteronomy is described as someone who lies in wait to describe someone who's planning something out because of the hate within their heart, okay? Jealousy, and as we go on through the next several commandments and we talk about some of this premeditated hatred that exists previously, that is the root of murder, even just beginning with that hatred in your heart and beginning to devise plans, okay? Someone who breaks into my house and all of a sudden I've got to grab a pistol to protect my family, that's not me making a plan because I hate that person, okay? That's something that happens within the moment, and I'm protecting my family. And so hopefully through some of those scriptures and the details within those scriptures, we can tell a difference in killing, in murder. I don't want to spend a ton more time on all this. Going to try to keep us moving. Of course, I think, again, I don't want to go down a political path. I don't want this to turn into a 5-week series here. But I think God wants us to have a true respect for human life. Okay?
I have a question there.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's bothered me for a while.
All right. I don't know that I'll have the answer, but we'll listen.
In the Old Testament, this woman lost her husband. And then his brothers was supposed to take her in marriage.
Okay.
And they didn't want to, and they wasted their seed on the ground, and God killed them. Now tell me what the difference is in that and birth control.
Boy, that's a class that I'm going to let Will or Pat teach later, I think, because that just went down a path that I wasn't ready for, Esther.
Well, that's human life to God,
Yeah.
evidently.
I'm gonna have to have a few more weeks of study before I can come back and answer that. Okay.
Expect an answer.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
She sounds like a
So, great question. You've probably prodded some study out of me in the coming months or weeks, but I don't have the right answer for that right now. And I learned that way back when I was teaching U.S. history class in Burnet High School, when a kid would ask a question. I didn't act like I knew. I just kind of say, I'm going to have to study that and get back to you before I give you the answer to that. Jay?
Well, one of the things I would want to say about that is the birth control, maybe it wasn't the sin, maybe it was the lack of taking up the responsibility.
Or obeying God.
Yeah. It could just simply boil down to obeying God. Just obeying God. Again, maybe that's a path that, I mean, we can come back to that. Somebody else can do a series on that later. I know this is a hot topic. Again, I don't want to get political. We have elections coming up here in another month or two or so, and just abortion and the talk of that. And I don't want to have a political discussion, debate in here. I promise I don't. I just quickly want to mention that I really think that these things boil back down to being the things that are applicable to God. You know, when you think about those words, the unlawful and immoral taking of a life, I know, we all know, there are situations that threaten a child's life, a mama's life, all that kind of stuff that and we could debate this for weeks and weeks and weeks, but I think God just wants us to respect human life and understand the precious gift of human life, and to understand that we should not unlawfully and immorally take another human life just because we feel like it, just because it simply is the temperature of the day that we're going to do that. And so
A lot of
United States, or was prior to all the political stuff, was caused by a lack of religion in the inner cities. They have seen their grandmother do it, they've seen their mother do it, and it was not something that was talked about nor seemed to affect them.
You bet.
Before it becomes their normality.
Yeah. Becomes normal to them because you go back to what we started with today. They do not have a proper perspective of God Almighty as the Creator. That's what allows something like that to become normal. We could stay on the sixth commandment for a while longer. Esther, all right.
What does God think about the young men that causes that woman to get pregnant?
That is a discussion within itself as well. That becomes a problem. All that behavior becomes a problem that is not in line and not in step with the very nature of God.
Especially the ones that do not want to take their responsibility to raise the child.
Sure.
And so,
And this kind of steps into some of that. Of course, the seventh commandment of thou shalt not commit adultery. And, all right, so here we are again. I thought we'd be about halfway through this commandment. And so
You said we weren't talking.
yeah. I tried to keep us moving. Try to keep us moving, though. Man, it is tough, isn't it? Just the right amount of talking. I have to start.
You spoke up.
No, I appreciate your comments, and so we'll go however long it takes us to get through the series. But that is where we're headed next. Thank you for being here this morning. Thank you for your comments.